It all started innocently enough. I had inherited my family's land years ago, a sprawling 250-acre plot nestled along the gentle bends of a river in the Midwest. The land had been in my family for generations, and though it wasn't particularly developed, it had a beauty that was hard to describe, a mosaic of open meadows, dense woodlands, and the steady hum of wildlife that seemed to exist in harmony with one another. For years, I would visit on weekends, sometimes camping, sometimes simply walking the trails and reflecting on how the land had shaped my ancestors' lives. But as time went on, I realized that the value of the land wasn't just sentimental. Developers were starting to circle. I had resisted selling because the land felt alive, almost sacred, and I couldn't shake the thought that any construction would destroy the delicate balance of nature I had grown to love. Little did I know, the HOA from the nearby suburban development had already set their sights on my property. At first, they sent polite letters suggesting that future plans might align with community expansion. I ignored them, confident in my legal ownership and unwilling to compromise what was rightfully mine. But the letters escalated into demands, then threats. One morning, I received a call from the HOA president, a particularly self-righteous woman named Marlene, informing me that construction crews had begun clearing parts of my land. "It's for the good of the community," she said. "You'll thank us someday." I was stunned. How could they just take action on private property like that? I quickly contacted my attorney, who assured me that the law was firmly on my side, the land was mine, and no association had the right to develop it without my consent. But the damage was already underway. Bulldozers had leveled portions of my fields, and construction crews were marking plots for 58 houses, complete with streets, cul-de-sacs, and sidewalks. My anger boiled over. I spent the next few days surveying the land, documenting every violation, every breach of my property rights, and planning a way to respond that would not only reclaim control of my land but also ensure that the HOA and its members learned a lesson they would never forget. That's when the idea struck me: my property had natural defenses that no human force could easily overcome. At the far edge of the river that ran through my property, decades ago, my grandfather had built a series of small dams to manage seasonal flooding and water flow. Over time, the dams had become forgotten relics, a silent network of gates and sluices that could be manipulated to control water levels across hundreds of acres. I realized that if I reopened the gates in the right sequence, I could let the river reclaim the areas under construction, washing away roads, foundations, and whatever homes had been erected. It wasn't about revenge alone, it was about protecting the land and its natural integrity. I spent hours poring over old maps, studying the hydrology, calculating volumes, and determining the optimal time to release the water. Every detail mattered, because once the gates were opened, the forces of nature would be unstoppable. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their audacious construction, oblivious to the looming consequences. They bragged about the progress, posted updates to local news outlets, and sent pictures of the nearly completed streets, all while I silently prepared. The tension escalated daily, neighbors whispered about the feud, and Marlene herself had begun calling me, demanding explanations, trying to intimidate me. I never responded. I didn't need to. The land and the river had a voice of their own, and soon, they would speak louder than any HOA official could imagine. The day I decided to act dawned gray and humid, the kind of morning that foreshadows dramatic change. I arrived before sunrise, my truck loaded with tools, floodgate keys, and a notebook filled with meticulous diagrams. Walking through the muddy trails, I could see the progress the HOA crews had made, the roads cut through what used to be dense woodland, construction trailers parked haphazardly, and the foundations of half-built houses jutting out like open wounds on the landscape. Despite the chaos, there was a strange beauty in the scene. The morning mist clung to the treetops, the river flowed silently alongside the cleared land, and birds, oblivious to the human encroachment, chirped their usual songs. I moved quickly, checking each dam and gate, ensuring everything was in working order. The dams had aged, yes, but they were sturdy, built by hands that understood the power and rhythm of water. As I walked, I recalled the stories my grandfather had told me as a boy, how he had used these gates to save crops from floods, to replenish wetlands, and even to redirect water to drought-stricken fields. The knowledge he had imparted was coming full circle now. I arrived at the main dam and carefully checked the sluice gates. Each lock clicked into place as I manipulated the levers, opening valves just slightly to allow water to rise gradually in controlled channels. I didn't want sudden destruction. Nature works on its own timetable, and so did I. Meanwhile, I could hear the distant sounds of construction, hammers pounding, engines roaring, and voices shouting instructions. Marlene had apparently taken it upon herself to oversee the progress, walking around with a clipboard like she owned the place, though I knew legally she owned nothing. As I worked, I felt a surge of calm, a quiet confidence that I was about to correct a grievous injustice. By late morning, everything was in position. The water levels behind the dams were optimal, and the channels leading to the newly constructed streets were primed to overflow. I paused, taking in the scale of what was about to happen. 58 houses. 58 plots of land that had been desecrated without permission. 58 lessons that Marlene and her HOA would soon learn. I activated the final lever, and the gates began to creak open fully. Water, long contained, surged forward with a quiet menace, spilling into the lower areas where roads and foundations had been laid. At first, it was subtle, a trickle into ditches, then small streams forming along the streets. Crews noticed and began running around in panic, shouting to each other and trying to divert the water, but it was too late. The river's flow was relentless, unstoppable once it reached this point. I watched from a safe distance, adrenaline pumping, as the streets slowly transformed into channels of muddy water. Foundations that had been poured with such confidence began to wash away, and the earth, loosened by construction, gave in to the rising current. Marlene screamed over the chaos, her voice carrying across the floodwaters, demanding explanations, pleading for someone to stop me. I remained silent, only observing the elegant efficiency of nature reclaiming what had always belonged to it. By noon, the full impact was visible, roads were gone, construction equipment was partially submerged, and the land looked more like a river delta than a suburban development. I felt a grim satisfaction, not out of malice, but out of a sense that justice, in its purest and most natural form, had been served. By mid-afternoon, the full magnitude of the flood was undeniable. News crews, alerted by frantic calls from Marlene and other HOA members, began arriving, capturing the chaos from helicopters and drones. I stood atop a small hill near the main dam, watching the water snake through the property like a living thing, reshaping the terrain in ways no bulldozer ever could. Streets that had taken weeks to construct were now unrecognizable ribbons of mud and debris. Foundations were partially submerged, some of them collapsed entirely, leaving only jagged concrete jutting out from the churned earth. Equipment abandoned in the confusion, tractors, cement mixers, and even construction trailers, floated aimlessly or leaned at precarious angles, victims of a natural force that no human arrogance could withstand. I could see Marlene running frantically along the upper embankments, shouting at the crews, waving her arms, and looking entirely powerless against what was unfolding. Her face, red with fury and disbelief, was framed by her meticulously styled hair, now slightly disheveled from the wind and rain. I felt no pity. She had trespassed, ignored warnings, and treated my land as if it were her own. The water, patient and inevitable, was merely enforcing the rules she had failed to respect. As I surveyed the scene, I noticed the reactions of the neighboring homeowners who had not been part of the trespass. Some were in shock, staring from the edges of their properties as the flood reshaped the landscape. Others were gleeful, whispering to each other about the poetic justice being served. It wasn't just the destruction of property, it was a message, one that nature delivered more eloquently than any lawyer could. Over the next several hours, I moved among the channels, ensuring that no water could escape into areas that were untouched. I wasn't reckless, I respected the balance of the land, only targeting the areas where the HOA had overstepped. I could hear Marlene calling her attorneys repeatedly, her voice rising in panic as she demanded someone stop me, claiming that this was criminal, that I was intentionally causing damage. I had anticipated this reaction. In fact, every move I made was documented legally. I had photos, videos, and detailed notes showing the history of my property, the illegal construction, and the careful, controlled release of water that targeted only the intruding development. My attorney had advised me to remain calm and let the natural course of events speak for itself, which I did. As evening approached, the water had mostly settled into its new channels, leaving behind a landscape that was messy, raw, and undeniably altered. The partially completed homes were ruins, streets were gouged with mud, and the air smelled of wet earth and displaced vegetation. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange combination of exhaustion and triumph. Justice had not been delivered by courts, police, or city officials, it had been delivered by the land itself, the same land Marlene had thought she could control. Watching her storm around in helpless frustration, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was more than revenge, it was restoration. The land was reclaiming its narrative, reminding everyone that some forces, especially those rooted in nature, cannot be bent, bribed, or ignored. And I, as its steward, had merely facilitated what was always inevitable. The aftermath of the flood was surreal. By morning, the news had gone viral, with videos of the submerged construction sites circulating on social media, drawing both awe and outrage. Reporters arrived in droves, interviewing neighbors, construction workers, and even Marlene herself, whose fury had not subsided overnight. She waved her hands wildly, yelling into cameras about criminal sabotage and reckless destruction, but no one seemed to side with her entirely. People were captivated by the audacity of the situation, an individual using the natural power of his own land to defend it against overreach. I stayed mostly in the background, answering questions briefly, calmly, always careful to emphasize that I had acted within my rights as the property owner. My attorney had prepared me for the inevitable legal fallout, and I was ready. Letters from the city and the HOA flooded in, threatening lawsuits, fines, and injunctions, but each was met with meticulous documentation proving ownership, prior warnings, and the controlled, non-destructive nature of my actions toward anything beyond the illegally encroached area. Surprisingly, public sentiment was overwhelmingly on my side. People respected the idea of a landowner defending his property against bureaucratic arrogance, and many expressed admiration for the clever use of natural forces. Some even visited the site, walking along the newly formed channels and marveling at how quickly nature could reshape what humans had so painstakingly built. Meanwhile, Marlene's authority within the HOA crumbled. Board members began resigning, fearful of being associated with someone who had shown such reckless entitlement. The HOA itself faced scrutiny from local government for attempting construction without proper permits, and investigations into their violations began immediately. I found it almost poetic that the same people who had flaunted their rules over my land were now ensnared by the consequences of their own overreach. Amid all this, I spent my days walking the property, assessing the damage, or rather, the restoration, while also planning the next steps to ensure long-term protection. I reinforced certain dams, planted trees to stabilize eroded areas, and even created signs to mark property boundaries clearly, ensuring that no future trespassers could attempt such audacity. Neighbors and visitors began referring to the area as the river reclaiming its own, and though I didn't seek fame, the story of the flood had taken on a life of its own, cementing my reputation as a formidable protector of the land. Through it all, I realized that the experience had changed me. There was a deeper connection now, a profound understanding of the balance between human ambition and the natural world. I hadn't just defended property, I had witnessed firsthand how patience, preparation, and respect for natural forces could achieve what force and fury never could. Marlene, defeated and humiliated, eventually stopped making public statements. The HOA attempted to regroup, but the damage to their credibility, and their partially built houses, was irreparable. I, on the other hand, found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my family's land was safe, reclaimed, and more resilient than ever. Nature had been my ally, and in defending the land, I had defended a legacy that stretched back generations. Months passed, and life on the property slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The river had carved new paths, the forest had begun to reclaim areas previously cleared, and the air smelled fresher than it had in years. The 58 houses that the HOA had attempted to build were gone, leaving behind only the faintest remnants of concrete and gravel, reminders of human arrogance meeting natural inevitability. I spent my days tending the land, planting native trees and shrubs to prevent erosion, and walking the trails that meandered through meadows and woods, feeling a deep, almost spiritual connection to the place I had protected. Marlene's attempts to recover her losses fizzled under legal scrutiny, and she eventually resigned from the HOA in disgrace, her credibility permanently tarnished. The remaining members were forced to acknowledge their mistakes, pay fines, and accept that private property rights were not something to be trifled with. I had been offered money, media appearances, and even book deals, but I declined all of it. This was never about wealth or recognition, it was about stewardship, legacy, and the unspoken contract between humans and the land they inhabit. Friends and neighbors often asked if I regretted my drastic measures, but I never did. I had acted decisively, within the law, and with careful thought to the consequences. More importantly, I had preserved something irreplaceable, the harmony and integrity of the land itself. Over time, the story of the flood became local legend, a cautionary tale about arrogance, greed, and the power of nature when wielded intelligently. Children would point to the flowing channels and ask their parents about the river that defended itself, while adults would nod, a knowing glint in their eyes, acknowledging the wisdom and resolve it took to orchestrate such an outcome. As for me, I remained the quiet observer, the caretaker of this living legacy. I often stood at the edge of the main dam during sunset, watching the golden light dance on the water, reflecting off the newly grown greenery, and feeling the enduring pulse of the land beneath my feet. In that quiet, I understood something fundamental. True power isn't about domination, wealth, or control, it's about understanding, patience, and the courage to act when justice and nature align. And on that land, now reclaimed and thriving, I knew that my family's legacy would endure for generations, safe from those who would try to impose their will on it. The river had spoken, the dams had done their work, and I had kept my promise to the land. In the end, balance had been restored, and I had witnessed firsthand the extraordinary force of nature guided by human determination, a lesson that would echo through the valley long after all human voices had faded.